Hello everybody, I'm back again and the microphone appears to be working this time, so that's wonderful. Hello, how are you? Welcome. I've got my water, I've got some peanuts to snack on in the chapter breaks. We are going to continue with the story of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, and this chapter is chapter 28 called Curdie's Guide. The previous chapter was when they were trying to get the goblins out of the house, and Curdie had concluded with the thought that it would have been a good idea if they'd actually held the king, the queen, and the prince goblin captive until they had got Princess Irene back from the goblins, because that's where he assumed that they were. So Curdie's Guide, chapter 28 of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. We shall carry on. So here we go. That looks a lot better. Looks a lot more like what I was expecting it to look like. Anyway, just as the consolation of this resolve, they thought that they should have kept the king, queen, and prince goblin captive until they could get the princess back. Their princess, not the goblin's princess, dawned upon his mind, and he was turning away for the cellar to follow the goblins into their hole. Something touched his hand. It was the slightest touch, and when he looked he could see nothing. Feeling and peering about in the grey of the dawn, his fingers came upon a tight thread. He looked again, and narrowly, but still could see nothing. It flashed upon him that this must be the princess's thread, the one that he didn't believe in, remember? Without saying a word, for he knew no one would believe him any more than he had believed the princess, he followed the thread with his finger, contrived to give Looty the slip, and was soon out of the house and on the mountainside. Surprised that, if the thread were indeed her grandmother's messenger, it should have led the princess, as he supposed it must, into the mountain, where she would be certain to meet the goblins rushing back, enraged from their defeat. But he hurried on in hope of overtaking her first. When he arrived, however, at the palace where the place where the path turned off for the mine, he found that the thread did not turn with it, but went straight up the mountain. Could it be that the thread was leading him home to his mother's cottage? Could the princess be there? He bounded up the mountain like one of his own goats, and before the sun was up, the thread had brought him indeed to his mother's door. There it vanished from his fingers, and he could not find it, search as he might. The door was on the latch, and he entered. There sat his mother by the fire, and in her arms lay the princess, fast asleep. "Hush, Curdie," said his mother, "do not wake her. I'm so glad you've come. I thought the cobs must have got you again." The cobs being the miner's name for the goblins. Right, carrying on. With a heart full of delight, Curdie sat down at a corner of the hearth, on a stool opposite his mother's chair, and gazed at the princess, who slept as peacefully as if she had been in her own bed. All at once she opened her eyes and fixed them on him. "Oh, Curdie, you've come," she said quietly. "I thought you would." Curdie rose and stood before her with downcast eyes. "Irene," he said, "I'm very sorry I did not believe you." "Oh, never mind, Curdie," answered the princess. "You couldn't, you know. You do believe me now, don't you?" "I can't help it now. I ought to have helped it before." "Why can't you help it now?" "Because just as I was going into the mountain to look for you, I got hold of your thread, and it brought me here." "Then you've come from my house, haven't you?" "Yes, I have." "I didn't know you were there." "I've been there 2 or 3 days, I believe." "And I never knew it. Then perhaps you can tell me why my grandmother has brought me here." "I can't think." "Something woke me. I didn't know what, but I was frightened, and I felt for the thread, and there it was. I was more frightened still when it brought me out on the mountain, for I thought it was going to take me into it again, and I liked the outside of it best. I supposed you were in trouble again, and I had to get you out, but it brought me here instead. And oh, Curdie, your mother has been so kind to me, just like my own grandmother." She's only 7, remember. Here Curdie's mother gave the princess a hug, and the princess turned and gave her a sweet smile, and held up her mouth to kiss her. "There, then you didn't see the cobs?" asked Curdie. "No, I haven't been into the mountain, I told you, Curdie." "But the cobs have been in your house, all over it, and into your bedroom, making such a row." What did they want there? It was very rude of them. They wanted you to carry you off into the mountain with them, to be a wife for their Prince Harelip." "Oh, how dreadful!" cried the princess, shuddering. "But you needn't be afraid, you know. Your grandmother takes care of you." "Ah, you do believe in my grandmother, then? I'm so glad. She made me think you would some day." All at once Curdie remembered his dream and was silent, thinking. "But how did you come to be in my house, and me not know it?" said the princess. Then Curdie had to explain everything, how he had watched for her sake, how he had been wounded and shut up by the soldiers, how he heard the noises and could not rise, and how the beautiful old lady had come to him, and all that followed. "Poor Curdie, to lie there hurt and ill, and me never to know it," exclaimed the princess, stroking his rough, work-worn hand. "I would not have hesitated to come and nurse you if they had told me." "I didn't see you were lame," said his mother. "Am I, mother? Oh, yes, I suppose I ought to be. I declare I've never thought of it since I got up to go down amongst the cobs." "Let me see the wound," she said. He pulled down his stocking, when, behold, except a great scar, his leg was perfectly sound. Curdie and his mother gazed in each other's eyes full of wonder, but Irene called out, "I thought so, Curdie. I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was sure my grandmother had been to see you. Don't you smell the roses? It was my grandmother healed your leg and sent you to help me." "No, Princess Irene," said Curdie, "I wasn't good enough to be allowed to help you. I didn't believe you. Your grandmother took care of you without me." "She sent you to help my people. Anyhow, I wish my King Papa would come. I do so want to tell him how good you have been." "But," said the mother, "we are forgetting how frightened your people must be. You must take the princess home at once, Curdie, or at least go and tell them where she is." "Yes, mother, only I'm dreadfully hungry. Do let me have some breakfast first. They ought to have listened to me, and then they wouldn't have been taken by surprise as they were," because he'd been trying to warn them that the goblins were about to break in. "That is true, Curdie, but it is not for you to blame them much. You remember?" "Yes, mother, I do. Only I must really have something to eat." "You shall, my boy, as fast as I can get it," said his mother, rising and setting the princess on her chair. But before his breakfast was ready, Curdie jumped up so suddenly as to startle both his companions. "Mother, mother," he cried, "I was forgetting. You must take the princess home yourself. I must go and wake my father." Without a word of explaining, he rushed to the place where his father was sleeping. Having thoroughly roused him with what he told him, he darted out of the cottage. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm going to have a drink of water. Come on, you have yours too. I'm just going to put, for those of you who've only just arrived, because you won't see the past chat, I'm just going to put the links, when I get the right place on the thing, the links for our Discord server where you can ask people about the stories and where you can post pictures that you might have drawn or made of what you think things might look like. Sometimes drawing things from pictures that we get in our imagination is a good way to do things. It helps us to hold on to the story ideas a bit longer. And yes, they will be different to the illustrations that were done for the book, but if you look at the illustrations I've already posted, of which I have more yet to do, you'll see that two different artists from two different editions of the book have done completely different styled illustrations. So everyone gets different pictures in their head when they're listening to a story. So please come and join us over on Discord, and if you would like to listen to more stories, complete books that have been read through, I have playlists over on my YouTube channel. So there you go, you've now got the links. We shall carry on with The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, chapter 29, Mason Work. He had all at once remembered the resolution of the goblins to carry out their second plan upon the failure of their first. No doubt they were already busy, and the mine was therefore in the greatest danger of being flooded and rendered useless, not to speak of the lives of the miners. When he reached the mouth of the mine, after rousing all the miners within reach, he found his father and a good many more just entering. They all hurried to the gang by which, that's the tunnel, dug tunnel, by which he had found a way into the goblin country. There the foresight of Peter had already collected a great many blocks of stone with cement ready for building up the weak place, well enough known to the goblins. Although there was no room for more than 2 to be actually building at once, they managed by setting all the rest to work in preparing the cement and passing the stones, to finish in the course of the day a huge buttress filling the whole gang and supported everywhere by the live rock, that means the solid rock of the mountain. Before the hour when they usually dropped work, they were satisfied that the mine was secure. Then they heard goblin hammers and pickaxes. They had heard goblin hammers and pickaxes busy all the time, and at length fancied they heard sounds of water they had never heard before. But that was otherwise accounted for when they left the mine, for they stepped out into a tremendous storm which was raging all over the mountain. The thunder was bellowing and the lightning lancing out of a huge black cloud which lay above it and hung down its edges of thick mist over its sides. The lightning was breaking out of the mountain too, and flashing up into the cloud. From the state of the brooks, now swollen into raging torrents, it was evident that the storm had been storming all day. The wind was blowing as if it would blow him off the mountain, but anxious about his mother and the princess, Curdie darted up through the thick of the tempest. Even if they had not set out before the storm came on, he did not judge them safe, for in such a storm even their poor little house was in danger. Indeed, he soon found that but for a huge rock against which it was built, and which protected it both from the blasts and the waters, it must have been swept if it was not blown away. For the 2 torrents into which this rock parted, the rush of water behind it, united again in front of the cottage, 2 roaring and dangerous streams, which his mother and the princess could not possibly have passed. It was with great difficulty that he forced his way through one of them and up to the door. The moment his hand fell upon the latch, through all the uproar of winds and waters came the joyous cry of the princess. "There's Curdie! Curdie! Curdie!" She was sitting wrapped in blankets on the bed, his mother trying for the 100th time to light the fire which had been drowned by the rain that came down the chimney. The clay floor was one mass of mud, and the whole place looked wretched, but the faces of the mother and the princess shone as if their troubles only made them merrier. Curdie laughed at the sight of them. "I never had such fun," said the princess, her eyes twinkling and her pretty teeth shining. "How nice it must be to live in a cottage on the mountain." "It all depends on what kind your inside house is," said the mother. "I know what you mean," said Irene. "That's the kind of thing my grandmother says." By the time Peter returned, the storm was nearly over, but the streams were so fierce and so swollen that it was not only out of the question for the princess to go down the mountain, but most dangerous for Peter even or Curdie to make the attempt in the gathering darkness. Part of it is because where the princess lives is down the mountain, and where Curdie lives is further up the mountain, and so there's going to be more and more water as they get further down. Even if the rain has stopped, there's still water running. And in the darkness is when the goblins come out. "They will be dreadfully frightened about you," said Peter to the princess. Peter is Curdie's father. "But we cannot help it. We must wait till the morning." With Curdie's help the fire was lighted at last, and the mother set about making her supper, and after supper they all told the princess stories till she grew sleepy. Then Curdie's mother laid her in Curdie's bed, which was in a tiny little garret room, which is up in the attic, is a garret. As soon as she was in bed, through a little window low down on the roof, she caught sight of her grandmother's lamp, shining far away beneath, and she gazed at the beautiful silvery globe until she fell fast asleep. Chapter 30 is next, and it's time for another mouthful of water. Chapter 30 of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. The King and the Kiss. The next morning the sun rose so bright that Irene said the rain had washed his face and let the light out clean. The torrents were still roaring down the side of the mountain, but they were so much smaller as not to be dangerous in the daylight. After an early breakfast, Peter went to his work, and Curdie and his mother set out to take the princess home. They had difficulty in getting her dry across the streams, and Curdie had again and again to carry her, but at last they got safe on the broader part of the road, and walked gently down toward the king's house. And watched they see as they turned the last corner, but the last of the king's troop riding through the gate. "Oh, Curdie," cried Irene, clapping her hands right joyfully, "my king papa has come." The moment Curdie heard that, he caught her up in his arms and set off at full speed, crying, "Come on, mother dear, the king may break his heart before he knows that she is safe." Irene clung round his neck, and he ran with her like a deer. Then when he entered the gate into the court, there sat the king on his horse with all the people of the house about him, weeping and hanging their heads. The king was not weeping, but his face was white as a dead man's, and he looked as if the life had gone out of him. The men-at-arms he had brought with him sat with horror-stricken faces, but eyes flashing with rage, waiting only for the word of the king to do something. They did not know what, and nobody knew what. The day before, the men-at-arms belonging to the house, as soon as they were satisfied the princess had been carried away, rushed after the goblins into the hole, but they found that they had already so skilfully blockaded the narrowest part, not many feet below the cellar, that without miners and their tools they could do nothing. Not one of them knew where the mouth of the mine lay, and some of those who had set out to find it had been overtaken by the storm, and had not even yet returned. Poor Sir Walter was especially filled with shame, and almost entertained the hope that the king would order him to be decapitated, for the very thought of that sweet little face down among the goblins was unendurable. When Curdie ran in at the gate with the princess in his arms, they were all so absorbed in their own misery and awed by the king's presence and grief that no one observed his arrival. He went straight up to the king, where he sat on his horse. "Papa, papa," the princess cried, stretching out her arms to him. "Here I am." The king started. The colour rushed to his face. He gave an inarticulate cry. Curdie held her up the princess, and the king bent down and took her from his arms. As he clasped her to him, the big tears went dropping down his cheeks and his beard, and such a shout arose from all the bystanders that the startled horses pranced and capered, and the armour rang and clattered, and the rocks of the mountain echoed back the noises. The princess greeted them all as she nestled in her father's bosom, and the king did not set her down until she had told him all the story. But she had more to tell about Curdie than about herself, and what she did tell about herself none of them could understand except the king and Curdie, who stood by the horse's knee stroking the neck of the great white horse. And still, as she told what Curdie had done, Sir Walter and others added to what she told, even Lootie joining in the praises of his courage and energy. Curdie held his peace, looking quietly up in the king's face, and his mother stood on the outskirts of the crowd, listening with delight, for her son's deeds were pleasant in her ears, until the princess caught sight of her. Excuse me. "And there is his mother, King Papa," she said. "See, there, she is such a nice mother, and has been so kind to me." They all parted as the king made a sign to her to come forward. She obeyed, and she gave her his hand, but could not speak. And he gave her his hand, but could not speak. "And now, King Papa," the princess went on, "I must tell you another thing. One night, long ago, Curdie drove the goblins away and brought Lootie and me safe from the mountain, and I promised him a kiss when we got home, but Lootie wouldn't let me give it to him. I would not have you scold Lootie, but I want you to impress upon her that a princess must do as she promises." "Indeed she must, my child, except it be wrong," said the king. "There, give Curdie a kiss." And as he spoke, he held her toward him. The princess reached down, threw her arms round Curdie's neck, and kissed him on the mouth, saying, "There, Curdie, there's the kiss I promised you." Then they all went into the house, and the cook rushed to the kitchen, and the servants to their work. Lootie dressed Irene in her shiningest clothes, and the king put off his armour and put on purple and gold, and a messenger was sent for Peter and all the miners, and there was a great and grand feast, which continued long after the princess was put to bed. And that's the end of that chapter. Oh, goodness me, we are really getting through it now, aren't we? And this is the second to last chapter. It's chapter 31, and I'm having another drink of water. Sorry. Tickle at the back of my throat. So here we go. This is chapter 31, the second to last chapter of the book. The book being The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, and chapter 31 is called The Subterranean Waters. The king's harper, who always formed a part of his escort, that's the man who plays the harp, was chanting a ballad which he made as he went on playing his instrument, about the princess and the goblins and the prowess of Curdie, when all at once he ceased, with his eyes on one of the doors of the hall. Thereupon the eyes of the king and his guests turned thitherward also. The next moment through the open doorway came the Princess Irene. She went straight up to her father, with her right hand stretched out a little sideways, and her forefinger, as her father and Curdie understood, feeling its way along the invisible thread. The king took her on his knee, and she said in his ear, "King Papa, do you hear that noise?" "I hear nothing," said the king. "Listen," she said, holding up her forefinger. The king listened, and a great stillness fell upon the company. Each man, seeing that the king listened also, and the harper sat with his harp between his arms, and his fingers silent upon the strings. "I do hear a noise," said the king at length, "a noise as of a distant thunder. It is coming nearer and nearer. What can it be?" They all heard it now, and each seemed ready to start to his feet as he listened, yet all sat perfectly still. The noise came rapidly nearer. "What can it be?" said the king again. "I think it must be another storm coming over the mountain," said Sir Walter. Then Curdie, who at the first word of the king had slipped from his seat and laid his ear to the ground, rose up very quickly, and approaching the king said, speaking very fast, "Please your majesty, I think I know what it is. I have no time to explain, for that might make it too late for some of us. Will your majesty order that everyone leave the house as quickly as possible and get up the mountain?" The king, who was the wisest man in the kingdom, knew well that there was a time when things must be done and questions left until afterward. He had faith in Curdie and rose instantly, with Irene in his arms. "Every man and woman follow me," he said, and strode out into the darkness. Before he reached the gate, the noise had grown to a great thundering roar, and the ground trembled beneath their feet, and before the last of them had crossed the court, out after them from the great hall came a huge rush of turbid water, and almost swept them away. But they got safe out of the gate and up the mountain, while the torrent went roaring down the road into the valley beneath. Curdie had left the king and the princess to look after his mother, whom he and his father, one on each side, caught up when the stream overtook them, and carried safe and dry. When the king had got out of the way of the water a little up the mountain, he stood with the princess in his arms, looking back with amazement on the issuing torrent, which glimmered fierce and foamy through the night. Then there Curdie rejoined them. "Now, Curdie," said the king, "what does it mean? Is this what you expected?" "It is, your majesty," said Curdie, and proceeded to tell him about the second scheme of the goblins, who, fancying the miners of more importance to the upper world than they were, had resolved, if they should fail in carrying off the king's daughter, to flood the mine and drown the miners. Then he explained what the miners had done to prevent it. The goblins had, in pursuance of their design, let loose all the underground reservoirs and streams, expecting the water to run down into the mine, which was lower than their part of the mountain, for they had, as they supposed, not knowing of the solid wall closed behind, broken a passage through into it. The miners had blocked it off, remember. But the readiest outlet the water could find had turned out to be the tunnel they had made to the king's house, the possibility of which catastrophe had not occurred to the mind of the young miner until he placed his ear close to the floor of the hall. What was then to be done? The house appeared in danger of falling, and every moment the torrent was increasing. "We must set out at once," said the king, "but how to get at the horses?" "See if Shall I see if we can manage that? Said Curdie. Do, said the king. Curdie gathered the men at arms and took them over the garden wall and so to the stables. They found their horses in terror. The water was rising fast around them, and it was quite time that they were got out. But there was no way to get them out except by riding them through the streams which was now pouring from the lower windows as well as the door. As one horse was quite enough for any man to manage through such a torrent, Curdie got on the king's white charger and, leading the way, brought them all in safety to the rising ground. Look, look, Curdie, cried Irene the moment that, having dismounted, he led the horse up to the king. Curdie did look and saw high in the air, somewhere about the top of the king's house, a great globe of light shining like the purest silver. Oh, he cried in some consternation, that is your grandmother's lamp. We must get her out. I will go and find her. The house may fall, you know. My grandmother is in no danger, said Irene, smiling. Here, Curdie, take the princess while I get on my horse, said the king. Curdie took the princess again, and both turned their eyes to the globe of light. The same moment there shot from it a white bird which descended with outstretched wings, made one circle around the king and Curdie and the princess, then glided up again. The light and the pigeon vanished together. Now, Curdie, said the princess, as he lifted her to her father's arms, you see my grandmother knows all about it, and isn't frightened. I believe she could walk through that water, and it wouldn't wet her a bit. But, my child, said the king, you will be cold if you haven't something more on. Run, Curdie, my boy, and fetch anything you can lay your hands on to keep the princess warm. We have a long ride before us. Curdie was gone in a moment, and soon returned with a great rich fur, and the news that dead goblins were tossing about in the current through the house. They had been caught in their own snare. Instead of the mine, they had flooded their own country, whence they were now swept up, drowned. Irene shuddered, but the king held her close to his bosom. Then he turned to Sir Walter and said, Bring Curdie's father and mother here. I wish, said the king, when they stood before him, to take your son with me. He shall enter my bodyguard at once and wait further promotion. Peter and his wife, overcome, only murmured almost inaudible thanks, but Curdie spoke aloud. Please, your majesty, he said, I cannot leave my father and mother. That's right, Curdie, cried the princess. I wouldn't if I was you. The king looked at the princess and then at Curdie, with a glow of satisfaction on his countenance. I too think you are right, Curdie, he said, and I will not ask you again, but I shall have a chance of doing something for you some time. Your majesty has already allowed me to serve you, said Curdie. But, Curdie, said his mother, why shouldn't you go with the king? We can get on very well without you. But I can't get on very well without you, said Curdie. The king is very kind, but I could not be half the use to him that I am to you. Please, your majesty, if you wouldn't mind giving my mother a red petticoat. I should have got her one long ago, but for the goblins. As soon as we get home, said the king, Irene and I will search out the warmest one to be found and send it by one of the gentlemen. Yes, that we will, Curdie, said the princess. And next summer we'll come back and see you wear it, Curdie's mother, she added. Shan't we, King Papa? Yes, my love, I hope so, said the king. Then turning to the miners, he said, Will you do the best you can for my servants tonight? I hope they will be able to return to the house tomorrow. The miners with one voice promised their hospitality. Then the king commanded his servants to mind whatever Curdie should say to them, and after shaking hands with him and his father and mother, the king and the princess and all their company rowed away down the side of the new stream, which had already devoured half the road, into the starry night. They rode into the starry night. And that's the end of that chapter, and we have one more, so I'm having another drink of water. And you have yours now. Come on. We're nearly at the end. Goodness gracious me. What a story. It's definitely a fantasy story, not a typical story. Right. The last chapter of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. And the last chapter is chapter 32. And it is called The Last Chapter. All the rest went up the mountain, and it's not very long, up the mountain and separated into groups to the homes of the miners. Curdie and his father and mother took Lootie with them, and the whole way a light, of which all but Lootie understood the origin, that's all in the group, shone upon their path, but when they looked round they could see nothing of the silvery globe. For days and days the water continued to rush from the doors and windows of the king's house, and a few goblin bodies were swept out into the road. Curdie saw that something must be done. He spoke to his father and the rest of the miners, and they at once proceeded to make another outlet for the waters. By setting all hands to the work, tunnelling here and building there, they soon succeeded, and having also made a little tunnel to drain the water away from under the king's house, they were soon able to get into the wine cellar, where they found a multitude of dead goblins, among the rest the queen, with the skin shoe gone and the stone one fast to her ankle, for the water had swept away the barricade which prevented the men-at-arms from following the goblins, and had greatly widened the passage. They built it securely up, and then went back to their labours in the mine. A good many of the goblins with their creatures escaped from the inundation out upon the mountain, but most of them soon left that part of the country, and most of those who remained grew milder in character, and indeed became very much like the Scottish brownies, pixies. Their skulls became softer, as well as their hearts, and their feet grew harder, and by degrees they became friendly with the inhabitants of the mountain, and even with the miners, but the latter were merciless to any of the cob's creatures that came their way, until at length they all but disappeared. Still, and now we have a quote, "But, Mr. Author, we would rather hear more about the princess and Curdie. We don't care about the goblins and their nasty creatures. They frighten us, rather." "But you know, if you once get rid of the goblins, there is no fear of the princess or of Curdie." "But we want to know more about them." "Some day, perhaps, I may tell you the further history of both of them, how Curdie came to visit Irene's grandmother, and what she did for him, and how the princess and he met again after they were older, and how— but there, I don't mean to go any farther at present." "Then you're leaving the story unfinished, Mr. Author." "Not more unfinished than a story ought to be, I hope. If you ever knew a story finished, all I can say is, I never did. Somehow stories won't finish. I think I know why, but I won't say that either now. The end." There you go. Goodness gracious me, what an unusual story. Hey? And I'm going to show you a picture of the cover of the next story we're going to read, which is The Princess and Curdie. And I'll see if I can get the picture bigger. It doesn't want to get bigger. That's a shame. Let's see if you can see it. There it is. The Princess and Curdie. And I'm trying to get it so my webcam can focus on it. It's not focusing very well. Sorry about that. So that's the next book we're going to read. So that will be next time, which is Friday in New Zealand, because today is Wednesday in New Zealand. So it'll be Friday at 3 p.m. here in New Zealand. I'm just turning the pages until I find the first. Oh my goodness, the words are so much bigger in this one. I might need to change the size of the font. No, that's brightness. That's better. So the next book we will start next time, and we will leave that there. So what have you got planned for the rest of your week? Are you going to do some story illustrations? Are you going to look up these people? So I'm going to write in the chat there for you the name of the book and the author. So you can find out a little bit more about them, and you can find some of the illustrations. So there they are. Yes, that works. and you will be able to see a little bit more of the way somebody envisaged the story. Goodness me. And this one's going to have, I think, some of the Cobb's creatures in it, and the grandmother, and Curdie gets to meet her. So all sorts of things. We'll see how that one goes. And it's probably going to be another one that's slightly odd because it's another one by the same author. It's a continuation. So I'm going to finish now, which is a shorter session than normal, and I shall see you next time we read. Bye.